Next up, our speaker is going to be Shannon Olkers. So we appreciate her being here with us. She's going to be talking about the role of the LEPC in oil discharge prevention and contingency planning. So without further ado, I will kick it over to Shannon. Thank you.
My name is Shannon Olkers, and I own and am the principal consultant for Integrity Environmental. Our firm does environmental permitting for bulk fuel facilities in Alaska, and we work in fuel farms everywhere from Ketchikan to Adak to Prudhoe Bay. We often use LEPC planning documents in writing these spill plans, and I wanted to briefly share with you how we use this information and also ways that we think that LEPC planning could incorporate some of the oil spill response planning and be better prepared for emergencies, especially catastrophic ones that would impact, say, your fuel supply. So this is me when I'm not wearing a suit. This is in Prudhoe Bay on top of a tank, which is usually where you can find me. For today's discussion, we often find that there's some confusion about oil spill planning. Oil spill planning covers many different regulations and many different agencies. And so we wanted to briefly discuss just to make sure that there was clarity in everyone attending. The three most common oil spill response plans are the Spill Prevention, Control, and Countermeasures Plan, which is called the SPCC. There's a Facility Response Plan, which is called the FRP. And then there's an Oil Discharge Prevention and Contingency Planning Plan. That's called the ODPCP, or we also see it frequently just called the C Plan for Contingency Plan. I'm going to review each of these briefly so you can kind of see where they fall in the kind of tank farm. So SPCC plans meet 40 CFR 112, which is an EPA regulation. It applies to tanks that are 1,320 gallons in size or a combination of tanks that add up to 1,320 gallons, all the way up to a facility storage capacity of about 42,000 gallons. And typically they're located within 1/4 mile or 1,500 feet of navigable water. This is a 15,000 gallon self-dike tank in the background, and you can see it's clearly going to be an SPCC plan. Most facilities have an SPCC plan if they store fuel in any quantity. And that applies to all facilities. They all have SPCCs. As they get bigger, they will also require a facility response plan. These are facilities that are 42,000 gallons of total fuel stored or greater. They also meet something called a substantial harm determination that the EPA uses to show storage volume, location to navigable waters, and sensitive environmental factors such as wildlife populations. And then unique to Alaska, there are many facilities that are under the 42,000 gallon total storage volume, but they receive fuel by barge. And so the Coast Guard has special requirements for those tank farms to also have facility response plans, even though they don't necessarily meet the over 42,000 gallon total storage volume threshold. A fun fact is you'll see that this facility response plan is to meet two different regulatory agencies, the EPA 40 CFR 112 and then the Coast Guard at 33 CFR 154. They have an agreement, and the tank farm is split at the first valve inside secondary containment. So everything from your marine header all the way up to the tank, that first valve inside secondary containment, that's the Coast Guard's area. And then inside the secondary containment around the tank, that's the EPA, and that's the dividing boundary line. So the last plan I wanted to talk about is we call these the big boys, the Oil Discharge Prevention and Contingency Plan, or C Plan. This applies to facilities over 420,000 gallons or 10,000 barrels if you convert. This photo is a lovely farm in Sitka, definitely over the 420,000 gallons. I think one of their tanks is over 420,000 gallons. And these plans, rightfully so, are the most restrictive and have a lot of requirements for spill planning that are probably some of the best in the nation as far as ensuring safety and regulatory control. So that's sort of the overview of what spill plans are. And I think I have a poll, Logan, right now. Is that correct?
Yep. I'm going to steal your screen. 1 second here.
Yep. So I was going to ask you, what size bulk fuel facilities do you have in your region? And just the largest, or if you have all of them. It looks like most of you have all of the above. So you have some smaller facilities, some medium-sized facilities, and some big ones. Oh, they went to all of the above. Alaska is unique in the United States in that we store more fuel in bulk than anywhere else because of our distribution logistics. We have to bring it in by barge. There's no road system to a large chunk of Alaska. And so that necessitates the larger storage volumes. For comparison, the state of Washington has 8 facilities, I'd say, above 420,000 gallons of storage. They're all affiliated with refineries or bulk distribution centers at rail yards. Alaska has hundreds. I think for the fixed facilities on shore, it's something like 150 facilities maybe across the state. All right. It looks like the vast majority of you have either one large bulk farm or all of the above, a mix of the both. All right, so I got to share my screen again. Is that how this goes?
Yes, sorry.
Nope, that's okay. I just haven't done it this way before. All right, can everyone see Sitka?
Yep.
Let's see if I can. I am screen sharing. There we go. So spill plan contents cover a broad range of preparation and response. And the idea is that the different pieces of the spill plan allow the owner and operator to prevent spills in the first place, but also to adequately respond if a large spill was to happen. So spill planning requires owners and preparers to identify, assess, and mitigate known or suspected hazards that would affect the owner's ability to respond to a spill. And that's part of the prevention and preparedness piece. And so plan writers, like my company, we turn to local emergency planning commissions and committees because they have a lot of data that helps us know the local area better than we could individually. There's only 10 people on my team, and we know some communities very well personally, but we can't know every community we work in. I think right now we have bulk fuel plans, gosh, I don't even know, probably in over 50 communities in Alaska. And so knowing every single one at that individual local level would be very difficult. But when we look at the LEPC websites and the data that's available, or we contact the LEPC contacts in the communities, we're able to access this data that's been very thoughtfully researched. So I wanted to go over how we use LEPC information, because I think for a lot of the LEPC programs, I know that they anticipate the community using your data, like your evacuation route mapping. But I was not entirely sure that you guys were aware of how we're using it for oil spill response planning. So the first stop we typically make is to go through identified hazards, receiving environments, and operating limits at the local level. And that's on the left side is what we're looking for and how it correlates to spill plan contents. But on the right side, you'll see this is a typical hazard mitigation analysis from the LEPC group. So they typically go over earthquakes, tsunamis, landslides and avalanche risks in the community, flood and erosion, weather, volcanoes, and then human factors such as vandalism and terrorism. So we look to all of these LEPC subject areas for information that will help us complete the bulk spill planning. We also use emergency response communication information to help us fill out our reporting and notification sections as completely as possible. And we found over the years that the LEPC data is always the most up to date and the most complete when it comes to who the current harbor master is, who the mayor is, who is the police chief and fire department chief, because they only have one in this community. And so we look at things like the ICS and IMT arrangements at the local level and who fills which position. We look at emergency communication systems in use in the community, VHF channels that are common use. We also look at evacuation routes and shelter locations because both the facility response plan and the C plan require us to include evacuation routes and shelter locations as part of our emergency planning. And then we also look at community resources for spill response, and this can be almost anything. We had a spill response plan a few years ago. The state recommended practice was to use four-wheelers to access remote areas, but there was no way to rent or obtain a four-wheeler in the community. Same with vac trucks. A lot of people are like, oh, can we get a vac truck? Well, I don't know. Some communities don't have vac trucks, and we can't just put that into a spill plan if it's not there. It's not effective. So in addition to the standard spill response resources that you would think of, like boom or skimmers or skiffs that have tow handles for the boom, we're also looking at trained responders, communication equipment that we could utilize in the event of a spill, large community centers that could be turned into incident commands, staging areas for equipment that's coming in off a plane in great quantities because we have to take to the ocean to recover the fuel. These are all things that we look at in addition to just sort of the standard stuff that you would think of. And then finally, the key personnel information. And this is, if you want to think even broader, a lot of our spill plans are in places with like fish processing plants. We need to know who to call to turn off saltwater intakes, right? There's a lot of saltwater intakes at these fish processing facilities. We have to figure out who to call. And it has to be the person that can actually turn it off. It's not just the front desk person or the owner in Washington or up in Anchorage. It's got to be the guy who can literally run over there and turn it off. Same with harbor masters who can restrict access to the small boat harbor or get communications out to people. So this is what we're looking for when we go through the documents that you guys are preparing for a much different purpose. And I wanted to show you how we use that information in the C plans or any of our spill planning. And the reason for this is I feel like there's a lot of valuable information in the spill plans that a lot of community members are unaware of as far as how we respond and what resources can be brought into the community for spill response. And I do think that it would be easier and better communications if community members were looking at the spill plans more frequently, or at least during the renewal process every 5 years. So similar to how we looked at the LEPC data, these are the content areas of a spill plan that use LEPC data. And so if you opened up, say, a state of Alaska ODPCP, they're often in different locations, but the section headings are the same. And so if you look at the reporting and notification section, it's normally section 1.2, but some plans have it in different locations. Reporting and notification often lists the harbor master, the police chief, the mayor, all of these key critical local community contacts. We make a real large effort to make sure that they're correct, and then we call, but as you know, things change all the time. We also look at safety. Some communities have access to fire departments and some don't, right? So is there a fire department in the community that we can contact to help us with this and respond if there's a fire? We also look at traffic management with police assisting as far as restricting access to certain areas that maybe are inundated with fuel. We don't want people to go through. Same with the harbor master. Please keep people away. There's a slick in this area. Let vessels know. And then communications at the local level and making sure that everything is communicated safely and effectively and openly. That's typically a big, strong part of the LEPC, and we just connect into that network. Realistic operating limits is a section in the spill planning that talks about all of the things like volcanoes and tsunamis and wave height and current speed and all these things that realistically would make it harder to operate or that we would stop operations for at all. So high winds, after a major earthquake until everything's been checked out. These are all realistic operating limits that we put into the plans and identify and discuss. And I think that LEPC data goes into quite a bit of that, and it would be an interesting read for most of you who are on those committees. We also prepare response scenarios, and we utilize contracted resources, but there are also local resources such as airplanes for aerial surveillance, loaders to help dig trenches. Some of these we have memorandums of agreement with, some we don't. We have lots of memorandums of agreements with harbor masters and fire departments for utilization of some of their resources in spill response scenario. And so in our plans, when we write them, if you're in there, you know it, but that's not always true. And so I would encourage you to go look into these sections and make sure that they're accurately portraying your community and some of the response resources that are in there. And then lastly, there's a whole section, it's typically 1.8 of the big C plans. There's a facility diagram section, and we use all sorts of LEPC and community-based data to complete drainage routes, evacuation routes, traffic control and rerouting, boom information for exclusion booming for protected resources like fishing holes, subsistence beaches, and small boat harbors, the Coast Guard dock, you name it, it all goes into these facility diagrams to help illustrate the spill response scenarios, but also the data that would be useful in the event of a major emergency. Whew, that was a lot of information in one slide. So this next one, I wanted to just go over some of the ways that local communities are anticipated to be interacted with during a large spill. If fuel discharges to land, access becomes a community issue because there's two kinds of access. One is restricting access of people who normally are accessing these really tight port areas. They can't go in there right now because there's fuel on the road, in the ditches, however you want to look at it. So there's restriction of access, but we also need to maintain access for spill responders and equipment that are coming in. And so staging areas, especially in port locations, are very tight. There's hardly any room. And one of the ongoing conversations that we have, and I'll talk about this later in staging areas, is how does a community prepare for and maintain staging area capability? A lot of our staging areas also double as long-term parking for people who are fishing, doing seasonal work, out on the ferry, you name it. Or it's long-term storage for things like connexes or other things that can be moved, but are a big pain in the butt to move if needed. And like I said, we'll talk about staging areas in a minute because they're their own little section. We also look at drainage because many port areas have stormwater drains, and some communities have exceptional stormwater drainage mapping. And for all of you who are thinking that's me, thank you. If you have poor stormwater drainage because you've got many layers and lots of age and unknowns, it becomes a lot more complicated for someone like me to predict where the fuel's going to go if it enters the stormwater system. We also have drainage without the stormwater system through roads, ditches, structures. We had one spill that spilled across a packed loading area, but was arrested by a connex that had been plunked down in the way, and then it completely redirected the spill and flowed to a completely new place that we had never anticipated because we didn't know the connex was there. So drainage becomes this piece of the puzzle when we look at how to plan for it. But when spills actually happen, the better data we have about drainage, the better we can predict where fuel would go if it is released. Traffic management, keep in mind that if there's a major bulk spill, traffic management is not just going to be for a few hours, it's going to be over multiple days, if not a week. And it may also be paired with other emergency response actions if, say, the problem was caused by a landslide or an earthquake. And then on top of all of that, the owner and operator is responsible for all of these things, but they can't operate in a vacuum. The community also has responsibilities to help respond as far as protecting its citizens and working with the realities of an emergency. And so enforcing safety zones. Fortunately, fuel is fairly benign. Gasoline spills do have vapors, but it's not like the horror stories you read about in the lower 48 with rail cars overturning or whatever. So mostly the enforcing of safety zones is to keep people from interacting with the fuel. But if there's a large spill, you may have to evacuate residents because the vapors will be dangerous. There's a lot of it. And so those enforcing of safety zones become a partnership between the local community and the spill response experts, the joint command, unified command. All of those decisions will be made at that level. But I do think there's some emergency planning pieces to it that we typically don't see reflected in the LEPC documents. I also have some considerations for fuel discharges to water. most fuel facilities are along the water. And so we often talk to local communities about how vessel traffic will be managed to avoid any slicks, and how the spill is going to be communicated to incoming and outgoing vessels so they don't go through the middle of it, or they know to stay away until something changes. And then we also ask, how do you stay informed of response activities as they occur? Specifically on the water, they typically switch to a spill channel on the VHF radios, and we need to make sure that all of the community members that should be part of that channel are aware of that channel and can listen in, but they also should have direct connections to the joint, what are they called, JPO, the Joint Public Officer, or local liaison, who is also disseminating information and helping make sure that everyone's informed of these response activities as they change and occur. And then this last piece, are there any water intakes in the discharge path? We often see adjacent businesses that have saltwater intakes, and they need to be informed and shut off. And a lot of times it's just individual phone calls. And if you can tap into the local network, it's much more efficient to have those calls made by somebody who's in the community than by someone who's, say, in the environmental permitting unit in Anchorage, trying to make sure that we don't do anything. Pardon me. Okay. So let's talk about staging areas, because this one is a struggle. When spill response equipment comes to a community, it comes a number of ways. For most of Alaska, it's by air or vessel. There's along the road system and rail belt. You can also have things arrive on the train or by truck. Typically, the road accessible communities also have space for these, for the trucks and the rail cars to be parked. But a lot of communities at the airports and at the port areas where the fuel farms are, space is tight. And so one of the things we would encourage you as a planning group to do is think about ahead of time how you would clear space if you needed it for response equipment. And if this is a major spill, I mean, we could be bringing in barges, vessels, large fast tanks and bladders, skimmers with hydraulic units that probably take up at least 20 square feet on their own. And then the fast tanks and the bladders themselves can take up 50 feet in length by 6 to 8 feet wide, plus all the containment that goes around it. And that's where I think like knowing what's in the spill plan would help you guys plan better for some of these staging areas and what is available and what isn't. Because when we meet with communities, they're like, well, how much space do you need? And I'm like, well, if we're going by the worst case scenario, I need this much at the airport and maybe this much at the port. And then they laugh and they say, well, we can't get you that at the port. We can't get you that at the marina. I'm like, all right, well, let's break it up into chunks. Could I have 2 chunks this size? And we sort of start this negotiation of where we can stuff all these things and make sure that we can still access the spill and respond appropriately. And I think that's something that needs to be a two-way conversation, and knowing how much space you have available would help jumpstart that conversation and make it much smoother. I also noticed that preserving egress routes is very difficult for someone like me as a spill planner coming in. I know how traffic flows because I can see roads, but local communities often have side roads and alleys and things that look like you could maybe drive through them, but they really have a chain link fence that I can't see in aerial imagery. And so identifying and preserving egress routes, I think, is something that most communities desperately need to have more of. There's a lot of places I work with where there's only one road, one in and out. And so if that road gets removed, that causes a lot of problems as far as getting in and getting out. And then also the safety zone considerations if you're storing a lot of fuel, and we would only be recovering diesel fuel. Gasoline fuel does not necessarily get collected because of the vapors. That safety zone consideration about where you're storing stuff as a staging area and how that affects the surrounding businesses and what you need to issue as like community warnings or community information about that. All right, so these 2 figures are really good examples of how we use data from the LEPC groups. On the left is beautiful Sitka, and you can see that we've crafted an evacuation route to the first muster point from the LEPC. planning documents. And in this case, the facility actually has two locations. Blue is their south tank farm and red is their north, but they both go to the same evacuation route, which is Sitka High School. We also zoom in and do evacuation routes just from the tank farm to the main road. So sort of like a localized evacuation route. In Sitka, it's pretty easy. They just walk out the front door and get on the road. But in other places, they're kind of buried deep and have to leave the dock area before they can get to a main road. And so we have those sub evacuation plans, and we have sub muster points for all the locations personnel. On the right is a spill response plan where we utilized stormwater data available from the community, and we were able to overlay the storm drains. And can you see my mouse? Can you see my mouse?
Yep, we can.
Okay. So this is the tank farm. And if there was a bulk fuel spill, you would think that it would overwhelm this whole lot, maybe cross the road and end up somewhere over in this area near the T-dock, right? But because we have the stormwater system here, if these stormwater drains are not closed, they will enter the stormwater system and they actually end up spilling over here in a completely different location. And that's why stormwater drainage mapping is really, really useful to us, because we literally this tank farm at one point in its spill planning history had a spill plan written and for responding right here in this harbor. But once we realized the stormwater drainage system was in here, we had to completely rework the spill plan for where fuel would actually be transported to. I know that this is a difficult thing to create for many of the older communities, but what a difference in spill planning, right? I mean, if you're going to be prepared for an emergency, that's the way to do it. So I did have a couple of thoughts on how LEPC planning could be better for both of us, and that's my friend Andy in ADAC. And I just love this picture because it was a really great day. We got that thing behind us working, and it had not worked for a long time. And so I wanted to talk about addressing, there's two pieces to this. I wanted to talk about addressing bulk fuel facilities in your hazard identification and mitigation planning. So again, I want to reiterate, it is the owner and operator's responsibility to respond to a large fuel spill, but there are consequences to the community if there is a bulk fuel spill or even inaccessibility to the fuel. I'm sure all of you remember Haynes late last year having a landslide and the only road to the bulk fuel farm going out. And they had fuel insecurity because they couldn't access their fuel. And so I just wanted to drop these ideas. Alternative access routes to bulk fuel facilities is something that is often not available. We often have tank farms that are older and there's just one road in and out. From a community planning perspective, it would make a lot of sense if it was possible to create alternate ways of getting to these critical infrastructure pieces. We also look at other community fuel storage availability. For some communities, there's only one bulk farm and that's it. But other key pieces of infrastructure like power or businesses that use a lot of fuel like fish processors, they could build up their own capacity to have at least 2 or 3 days of power generation available in the event that the fuel farm was unable to deliver for whatever reason. And I think most of our communities are aware of the alternatives to transporting fuel to their location based on seasonality, but the cost varies. And I think that that's something that probably needs to be reviewed annually. And some things that were available last year, like the ferry in Southwestern Alaska, may not be available this year. So just sort of keeping abreast and knowing how you can get fuel transported to your to your community, and thinking outside the box as well. Some large fishing vessels can get special dispensation from the Coast Guard to drop fuel if there's truly an emergency, because they internally have 60,000 gallon tanks and they can part with 10 or 20,000 gallons if needed. And then lastly, we recommend operational controls. A lot of power generation plants will operate until they're close to low on their fuel gauges, and then they ask to be filled up again. You could theoretically work with the power plant to never go below 50%. So they have at least so many days of storage, or sorry, they have so many days of power generation in their storage on site. And that's just an operational control. It's just saying, hey, we're never going to let it go below 50%, and this is why. So a few other things. When you lose access to fuel, it affects your power generation for most communities. It also affects your high volume fuel users, fish processing plants that are in the middle of A season for cod. If there's no fuel, that's going to throw the economy into a screeching halt. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about heating fuel access. For many community members, especially low income members, they don't buy fuel in bulk. They buy fuel week to week or month to month because they can't afford to fill up the tank all at once. And so if you've got home heating oil deliveries and they're interrupted for whatever reason, say the road to the tank farms out, or the tank that had all the heating fuel in it had a leak and now you have no more heating oil, your lowest income members are going to run out of fuel much more quickly than other members of your community because they don't have reserves. They weren't able to put 1,000 gallons in at the beginning of the season. And so I know communities look at heating oil security as far as like it's the end of the season, but I would argue that there's many members of your community that end of the week is a big problem for them, much less the end of the season. All right, so another thing that LEPC groups could do that would help us greatly would be to provide a way to obtain the information that you are producing in multiple formats. We strongly suspect that many of the JPEGs and PDFs that are produced and posted on the websites for the LEPC planning documents were originally created in AutoCAD or ArcGIS, and then were PDF for the web, which is totally fine. But what we often have to do is make a series of phone calls to find out who we could ask to get the ArcGIS layer or the AutoCAD drawing for the stormwater drainage system. And it can be very time intensive because it's call this guy, call that guy, call this gal. Oh, this is the engineering group that did it for us. You can contact them directly. And sometimes we get the information in we get way too much. We get the entire design package for 50 years. Or we get a very specific piece of it, but it's still missing some of the components that we were hoping. So we know your primary job is not to provide us with data, but if you are thinking about users of your data, and there was a way to say, hey, email here for the ArcGIS georeference layer of this data, that would be amazing. I'd be super happy. Or even contact this person for georeference layers, and then we would at least know who to contact to start the process. And then I have a wish list for everyone attending. This is what Shannon would most like to see is georeference layers. Who knows if it will ever happen. But right now, we're seeing a lot of attention for landslide and avalanche zones and being asked if our tank farms are within those. That data is out there, but it's not necessarily accessible in a georeference format for all communities. And so we have to often look at it and then redraw it as a polygon in ArcGIS. And that's not as accurate as something that has the actual geospatial data in it. Pardon me. Same with flood and inundation mapping. Like the flood zone in the interior Alaska from the Army Corps of Engineers for the Chino Lakes Flood Project, fantastic. They email you the whole layer, you plop it in, it tells you the flood line right there. It's amazing. Many of our communities do not have that level of detail, but they do have a flood and inundation mapping. There was a big project, I think, in 2019, and most of them have that information. They just haven't necessarily gone onto the website yet. And so we're ending up contacting communities and saying, hey, do you have this? And they're like, oh, yeah, we do. So if that could be made public, that would be very helpful. Earthquake zone information is on my wish list, but that is a very, that's something that comes from multiple reports in multiple formats. And I don't know that it'll ever be something as simple as a georeference layer. Stormwater drainage routes are absolutely something that we often can find as a georeference layer, but making it more accessible would be really helpful. We also would love to see buried utility locations available as a georeference layer, especially if we have to start doing things like dig up contaminated soil or put in trenches to prevent it from reaching the water. Many of our industrial areas have a lot of utilities all packed into the same place. And so having those buried utility locations with georeferencing would be amazing. Again, this is my wish list. I know I'm probably not going to get all this. And then lastly, I'm sure you're wondering, every LEPC has tsunami evacuation and primary, secondary shelter locations. They have a nice PDF that you can print out and put on your fridge. But if we could get access to that as a georeference layer, not very few of them are out there as a georeference layer. They're just a PDF meant to be used by the community as an evacuation route, which is awesome. But then we end up having to draw in a reference layer from that PDF. And I'm pretty sure it was created in ArcGIS. So just a plug, if you are the person that does those for your community, we would love to see it as a georeference layer so we could just suck it in and drop it in on top of our mapping. And then it's the same and consistent as any other place it's used in the emergency planning universe. All right, thank you very much. I have some key takeaways here. Bulk fuel facilities use LEPC data and information to complete spill plans. There is information in the spill plans that I think the LEPC groups should be aware of and more knowledgeable about. And I do think that LEPC plans could be better by including bulk fuel facilities and fuel access in their hazard mitigation analysis. And then some minor changes to data presentation would make LEPC plans easier for spill planners like us to access and use accurately and consistently. So I have some resources, and this presentation is downloadable from the website. So if you want to obtain this slide, you can go there. On the left, you can view any current ODPCP plan. And remember, that's for facilities 420,000 gallons or larger at that link, and download them and look at all of those different sections that I mentioned. The state of Alaska has an excellent spill prevention and response plan at that link, or spill prevention and response division at that link. And there's a lot of FAQs, guidances, home heating oil tank references. There's all sorts of information on that page. It's a good one to have. And on the right side, the EPA SPCC FAQ page is fantastic. It answers almost every question you could ever think of you might have about the SPCC. And it's in plain English, which for the EPA is a borderline miracle. So I really enjoy that page. And I think if you do emergency planning, you should be at least aware of how the SPCC interacts with fuel storage. And then the last link, the Coast Guard, they don't necessarily have a FAQ page or how facility response plans work, but they do have a really good inspection checklist. And so if you download that PDF, you will literally know every part of a facility and how it should function and what they are looking for when they come to your facility. But I think it would also be useful for emergency planners because you can see what the Coast Guard is looking for as when it comes to capability, prevention, and response.
Thanks, Shannon. We appreciate that. I'm really unfamiliar with a lot of that, so that was very, very enlightening for me. So I hope everyone else got as much out of it as I did. We have. I'm going to go. If anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat there, and then we'll see what we can get answered. One question starting off from. I'm sorry if I butcher your name. It looks like Asha Kamaroff. Who does the city and village multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plan updates? Do you know that one, Shannon?
I don't. I have a strong suspicion that it varies by communities. In some communities, the boroughs do a lot of the hazard mitigation plans for those communities in their region. Like Aleutians East Borough, for example, they do a really great job of updating those plans. In some places like Juneau's borough does it. You know, there's all sorts of I think it would depend on your community and how it interacts with its regional group.
Okay. And we have a comment here from Wendell Bishop. He says that sensitive critical infrastructure may have security concerns about public availability. So I think that was in reference to some of the availability of information.
Yes, show me all your storm drains and all your utilities. Yes, many of our facilities operate within facility security plans. But keep in mind that all of these C plans are publicly available. And we do keep that in mind. Like Port of Alaska, their facility C plans are not publicly available. But for the most part, where these facilities are, they may be a secure port, but I don't think the storm drains of utility locations are part of that critical sensitive information.
I don't see any more questions. One question I had was, these plans seem really complex. There's a lot of moving parts to them. How often are folks kind of re-examining their existing plans and kind of revisiting that and updating information and everything?
Almost all spill plans require a renewal or extensive review every 5 years. And then all owners and operators are required to update them within certain timeframes if key things change. So if your ability to respond to a spill, or you add a tank and your facility volume increases, you need to update it at that point. You wouldn't wait for the 5-year renewal. The timing differs on that. The Coast Guard and the SPCC plans give you 60 days from the change or 6 months from the change to get it in place. But the state, that has to be done sometimes within 5 days if it's like a key responsible person, for example, or it can be within 30 if you've got something like, hey, we added a tank and we need to increase our facility storage or whatever. That could be within 30 days.
Okay.
But in general, they all get an in-depth review at the 5-year level, and that's where public comment periods are, and people are encouraged to review and take part in that renewal process from a community level.
Awesome, thanks. So we got about 4 minutes left. It looks like, Tom, do you have a question there?
I just wanted to make a statement. You know, the person asking about the all hazards mitigation plan, for a couple of years, your division had funding and was actually hiring contractors to support communities and updating their all hazards mitigation plans. So you may want to take that person's name and talk to your people and see if you're still doing that. I don't know if that's still possible, but you guys actually had a contractor who had done that for years for people.
Okay, I'll take a look at that. Thanks, Tom. Looks like there's another question from Asha. The state has not funded LEPC for the last couple of years. How can we get that to be funded again?
If I knew the answer to that, Asha, I'd be a lot more wealthy than I am now.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for that either, Asha. Probably talk to representatives or folks like that, I think. Or is there any other questions for Shannon before we kick it off here? All right. Also, I guess one last maybe quick question that I had was, what's kind of the time frame that you have for developing one of these plans? Obviously, it's probably pretty variable depending on the size and complexity, but any kind of quick.
So the state of Alaska requires you to start a year before renewal or desired date of operation. So you typically issue some sort of notice that you're going to renew or that you would like to start up a tank farm about a year out. You typically issue a full draft to the state at the 6-month mark. And then during that 6 months, there's, for these bigger plans, there's at least one 30-day public comment period. And then you address all the public comments and reviews from the state. And then there's another 10-day comment period to review those responses. And then in very rare cases, there can be a second 30-day comment if there's some significant changes or a facility is not, basically they have to do some major changes to become compliant. Then you'll see a second 30-day RFAI, but that's pretty rare. I've only had one in 15 years of doing this. So.
Awesome.
Yeah, so it takes about a year. For the smaller plans, much less time, maybe like a 6-month time frame from start to putting fuel in the tank.
Awesome. All right, thank you, Shannon. We got 1 minute left, so I really appreciated your talk, and I'm sure other folks did too. So thank you for being here with us today.